Welcome, and thank you for watching Minnesota Housing's Introduction to the Home Investment Partnerships, also known as HOME, and National Housing Trust Fund tutorial. You are probably working on a development project that has recently been awarded a deferred loan of home funds, National Housing Trust Funds, or possibly a combination of both. This brief tutorial will take a high-level look at some of the most important aspects of the programs. There are additional tutorials on our website that go into more detail on this and other program topics. It is recommended that as you move along in your project, you watch the tutorials as they begin to apply. They can be found at www.mnhousing.gov. The tutorials are also linked in the portal help text to offer guidance as you are completing program due diligence items. Minnesota Housing's mission is to provide access to safe, decent, affordable housing and build stronger communities across the state by offering products and services to help Minnesotans buy and fix up their homes and stabilize neighborhoods, communities, and families. Minnesota Housing also supports the development and preservation of affordable rental housing through both the financing and long-term asset management of projects and developments. The agency has also pioneered a successful model for supportive housing that helps stabilize the lives of some of the state's most vulnerable citizens. This tutorial will briefly cover the following topics: the purpose of the programs, rent and income limits, the initiation of negotiations, choice limiting actions, bidding and construction standards, written agreements, property inspections, the affordability period, the effective period certificate, and finally next steps. As mentioned earlier, our website has additional short tutorials on these and other program topics. We recommend that you view all of them to help facilitate a smooth transaction for your project. HOME and the National Housing Trust Fund, or NHTF, are federally funded housing programs that help to preserve and increase affordable rental housing at various rent and income levels. Although there are broader uses for these programs, Minnesota Housing uses this funding for capital investments for new construction and the rehabilitation of multifamily rental housing. The HOME program targets low-income households in Minnesota. The National Housing Trust Fund program targets extremely low-income households in Minnesota, particularly those that have incomes below 30% of area median income. The deeper income targeting of National Housing Trust Fund lends well to supportive housing initiatives in the state. These programs are governed by their respective federal regulations. Minnesota Housing is charged with deploying funds and ensuring developers are complying with the program requirements. As a receiver of these scarce federal resources, you must comply with all of the program requirements. If you do not, there is potential that your project will lose the funding altogether. First, it is important to understand the difference between HOME and National Housing Trust Fund's rent and income requirements. HUD updates the rent and income limits annually, and we post the updated rent and income limits on our website at www.mnhousing.gov. It is important to note that the rent and income limits for HOME and National Housing Trust Fund are not the multifamily tax subsidy income, also known as MTSP limits, that are used for tax credits. It is also important to note that the rent and income limits for HOME are not the same as the rent and income limits for National Housing Trust Fund. At construction completion, 20% of the home units needs to be at or below the low home rent and income limits. The remaining home units must be at or below the high home rent and income limits. For National Housing Trust Fund units, all rent and income limits at construction completion must be at or below 30% of area median income or the poverty line, whichever is greater. The HOME and National Housing Trust Fund units can either be fixed or floating. Your federal program's project lead will let you know if your units will be fixed or floating. The rents, incomes, unit mix, and whether the units float or are fixed must be maintained during the compliance period. Refer to the Rent, Income, and Unit Mix tutorial on our website for more information, or contact the compliance officer assigned to your project. HOME and National Housing Trust Fund require compliance with various cross-cutting requirements that impact the entire project Examples of these cross-cutting requirements include the Environmental Review, the Uniform Relocation Act or URA for rehabilitation projects, and various labor standards requirements depending on the funding source. These cross-cutting requirements are triggered by the initiation of negotiations, or ION. The initiation of negotiations is the signing of the Funding Acceptance Agreement, which is the formal trigger of all cross-cutting requirements. The Funding Acceptance Agreement is signed at or shortly after project launch. It commits the developer and all other parties to compliance with all program requirements, including cross-cutting requirements. It is important that once the Funding Acceptance Agreement is signed, that no choice-limiting actions are taken by any part of the development team until Minnesota Housing has given approval. Choice-limiting actions are reviewed on the next slide. Again, it is very important that the development team understands that no choice-limiting actions are taken until Minnesota Housing provides explicit approval. If choice-limiting actions occur prior to approval, it can result in the loss of funds for the project. Examples of choice-limiting actions include signing contracts, purchasing supplies or materials, and any construction outside of normal property maintenance. The biggest cross-cutting requirement that affects choice-limiting actions is the environmental review. The environmental review is a review process that includes review and approval by HUD and other state agencies. The environmental review takes an average of 60 days or more to complete once all due diligence is submitted. A Phase 1 is required before the environmental review can be finalized. The 60-day period will not begin prior to Minnesota Housing receiving the Phase 1. Please view the environmental review tutorial for more information. Home and National Housing Trust Fund also require compliance with various bidding and construction standards. Projects receiving home funds must comply with all requirements, including Davis-Bacon. Projects that receive National Housing Trust Fund funds, but not home funds, do not need to comply with Davis-Bacon. Each of the bidding and contracting standards requires specific due diligence submissions. They also require specific forms and documents to be included in all contracts, including the architect's contract, the general contractor's contract, the attorney's contract, and any other required professional or construction contracts. In addition to specific forms in the contracts, these forms must also be included in the bid package. A tutorial specific to contracting and bidding is on our website. There is also a tutorial for Davis-Bacon. Remember to work closely with your federal programs team lead to make sure all requirements are followed to prevent unnecessary consequences, such as re-signing contracts or rebidding the project. Once a project has submitted all of its due diligence and is ready to close, the written agreement will be signed. The written agreement is the formal commitment of federal funds to the project. It outlines all of the minimum responsibilities of the developer. It states the funding award, the number of home and/or National Housing Trust Fund units, the unit mix, the rent levels, and all other key components the developer must satisfy. Home and National Housing Trust Fund funds will not be dispersed until the written agreement is signed. In addition, construction cannot occur prior to the execution of the written agreement and without Minnesota Housing's approval. This includes early starts. Projects receiving Home or National Housing Trust Fund funds will have various property inspections. If a project is rehabilitation or acquisition, an initial property inspection will occur prior to bidding the project. Any issues found in the initial inspection must be addressed during the rehabilitation. The project will also be monitored during construction by Minnesota Housing's architects. A final inspection will occur after construction completion as part of the project closeout process. During the final inspection, tenant files will also be inspected. Finally, Home and National Housing Trust Fund projects must submit to ongoing property inspections throughout the affordability period. The affordability period marks the time during which Home and National Housing Trust Fund units and the property must remain in compliance with all program guidelines. This is also known and referenced as the compliance period. The length of the affordability period is dependent on various factors. For home, If the project is rehabilitation and acquisition, the affordability period will be either 5, 10, or 15 years, depending on the amount of home subsidy per unit. If the home project is new construction, the affordability period is 20 years regardless of the amount of home subsidy per unit. For National Housing Trust Fund, the affordability period is 30 years regardless of the activity type or the amount of National Housing Trust Fund subsidy per unit. Compliance during the affordability period will be monitored by your assigned compliance officer. The signing of the effective period certificate begins the affordability period. The certificate is signed after all project closeout items are complete, including final inspections and after the final draw occurs. The certificate reaffirms the items in the written agreement. We covered a lot of information in this tutorial. This chart provides some context of when certain items occur during the project timeline. As you can see, the process begins at selection and ends once construction is complete. There are various touch points throughout the timeline. Your federal programs team lead will help facilitate the process and ensure all items are being completed. The federal programs team is also working diligently behind the scenes to make sure all federal requirements are met. For example, a cost allocation analysis occurs at various points throughout the project to determine the maximum home and National Housing Trust Fund awards a project can take and the minimum number of units required. Home and National Housing Trust Fund due diligence items are listed in the portal. Each item contains help text for guidance. When applicable, links to other tutorials have been embedded in the help text. Your federal programs team lead will also reach out as additional due diligence items become due. Thank you for watching Minnesota Housing's Introduction to the Home and National Housing Trust Fund Programs tutorial. Your federal programs team lead is listed in the portal. Feel free to reach out with any questions.